Good afternoon. I'm Michael Polyakov, the president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, and it is my honor to invite you to hear this fireside chat with Professor Lawrence Summers in our webinar, Antisemitism, Academic Freedom, and Board Leadership. I'm enormously grateful to Dr. Summers for finding this half hour in his packed schedule to share his thoughts on the growing disgrace and danger of antisemitism on college campuses and the ways we must combat it without compromising the freedom of speech, which is the very lifeblood of higher education. And we will keep before us the substantive steps that governing boards can take to make the course correction they need. After this half-hour conversation, stay with me when our guests will be the former professor of law and past president of the ACLU, Nadine Strossen, Columbia University professor Ellie Noam, and Pamela Paresky, senior fellow at the Network Contagion Research Institute. And we will then provide time for question and answer from our audience. And I will remind you to put your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be sent to everyone participating today and posted on our website, www.goacta.org. Lawrence Summers' distinguished career includes serving as the 71st United States Secretary of the Treasury, Chief Economist of the World Bank, and the 8th Director of the National Economic Council, and of course, as President of Harvard University. There is so much for us to discuss. Dr. Summers, you're a civic and education leader who sounded the alarm nearly 22 years ago in an address at Harvard morning prayers. And you ended that address saying, "It is my greatest hope and prayer that the idea of a rise of anti-Semitism proves to be a self-denying prophecy, a prediction that carries the seeds of its own falsification. But this depends on all of us." So I'd like to start our conversation thinking about what a do-over would look like for the disgraceful behavior of much of higher education, and Harvard in particular, after October 7, and the appearance before Congress that you once compared to a Saturday Night Live skit. But over to you, Professor Summers. If you would like, that do-over might start 2 decades ago, and the failure of higher education leaders to set the moral tone that you called for.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a privilege to be with this group, and I have followed ACTA's activities over many years, and while I've not agreed with every position you have taken, I think you have made over time an enormous contribution to our national academic life, and by doing that, to our national life. Look, I think the beginning of wisdom on this topic is to recognize a few things. The first is that academic freedom does not include freedom from criticism. And people have a right to express opinions, and people in their private capacities that don't disrupt or seek to intimidate others should be permitted to express their opinions, but they do not have the right to be respected for their opinions. They do not have the right to avoid criticism, even very great criticism, for what they do. And it is the obligation of leaders in any institution to uphold its basic morality and values. An institution. That means trustees. That means those who are presidents of universities. That's what I felt I was doing 20 years ago when I warned against actions that, if taken, would be anti-Semitic in their effect, if not necessarily in their intent. It seemed to me then, as it seems to me now, that an effort to single out for boycott and opprobrium the world's only Jewish state, who, whatever the merits of its policies, surely is not extraordinary in the ways in which it has violated or done the wrong thing vis-a-vis human rights, could reasonably be interpreted as having anti-Semitic effects. I believe that then. I believe it more now. I think one needs to recognize that it's perfectly legitimate to disagree, even to disagree strongly with Israeli policy, but that is a very different thing than calling for the delegitimization of the Israeli state. And those with the obligation to lead institutions have an obligation to push back on that. I think, frankly, that after I made my comments at Harvard, there was considerable impact. I did not persuade those who really were anti-Semitic and those who were, or those who were most extreme in their views. But I think a large, not highly engaged group just felt that they did not want to go near things that might be anti-Semitic, that they were best off staying away from these kinds of issues. And I think it's unfortunate that higher education leaders have not responded to encroaching anti-Semitism in the way that they have responded to other instances of prejudice. When Harvard remained a member of the American Studies Association institutionally, after the American Studies Association voted to boycott Israel, it was wrong. And so others, and so else with a dozen or more other academic associations. When the student newspaper at Harvard actively advocated boycott and divestment of Israel, and the university president only offered generalities about the non-desirability of boycott and divestment movements without addressing the anti-Semitic aspect of that proposal, I thought it was allowing prejudice to grow. When there have been multiple incidents of classes being disrupted by people with megaphones, and the university is unable to describe any disciplinary measures that have been taken, it is allowing anti-Semitism to grow. There is excuse me.
If I might, in your interview with AEI, which I recommend to everyone, it was a very, very informative interview, you had hesitation about the power of punishment as opposed to the power of moral leadership. And of course, we're seeing now, I think, a real shift, Vanderbilt, Pomona, and it brings me back to the time at UVA when pro-Palestinian demonstrators disrupted the Hillel Building Bridges program. And the university was totally reticent about whether there would be any punishment for this. Is it a time now for us to become clearer about the things that will be sanctioned?
I think one needs to distinguish between views which often should be condemned, but should not be punished. And acts or words designed to intimidate and bully, which should be subject to punishment. I think the first place, what I was going to explain is that there's a theory in criminology known as the broken windows theory, which basically says that when you don't disrupt, when you don't do anything about vagrants on the street who relieve themselves in public, when you allow broken windows to come into buildings and not be fixed, you change the atmosphere of a neighborhood and it becomes a place where crime is much more accepted and where it becomes much more difficult to maintain order. That there's a kind of early stage of maintaining norms that, if done successfully, causes incidents where you face punishment not to be necessary. And I think something similar applies in many contexts. I've had a certain amount of experience with education reform. Look, there are third grade teachers who can walk into a third grade classroom and the kids all look to the front of the room and get ready for the lesson. And there are other third grade teachers who lack that ability to set a tone, and they then debate whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to put students in the hall, because on the one hand, the students in the hall are not disrupting the class. On the other hand, they're not learning anything because they're in the hall. But in some sense, if you're debating the punishments, you've already lost because you failed to set the right tone.
I want to go back.
I think that's an important part of what has happened in higher education.
Thank you. I want to go back to the moral leadership issue. There was a pretty deafening silence on October 7. There were leaders like Ben Sass and the wonderful folk at Colorado Christian University who could call it what it was, a crime against humanity, full stop. And yet what we were hearing in so many other cases was a bit of equivocation, a bit of equivalency. Well, okay, we've got to do something about anti-Semitism. We've got to do something about Islamophobia. We rarely heard that full-throated, this is horrible. And I dare say that must have been one of the things that made the appalling performance on December 5, that the president's just
I'll tell you what I think about that. Michael. I thought when 35 student groups at Harvard were basically excusing Hamas and blaming Israel, and that was covered in newspapers that were read by more than 1 billion people, the decision of the Harvard administration to remain silent, and then when it spoke, to just decry the tragedy everywhere, was morally insensate, offensive, and incompetent. And that's why I spoke out as strongly and as vigorously as I did. I mean, you can argue about whether institutions should speak to the events of the day, but when 35 subgroups within your institution have spoken and have spoken offensively, it is inexcusable not to express institutional values. It is inexcusable that no one at Harvard has criticized the Harvard Center that maintains a partnership with Berzeit University, a center of terrorism in Harvard. I think the performance at the congressional hearing was appalling. But Michael, I want to be fair, and I don't think I've been particularly sparing in my criticism. But testimony at those hearings is a kind of performance art, and the Congress people are 10 feet higher in altitude than the witnesses. They are controlling the louder microphones. They are framing the inquiry. And so if you've never testified before, it can be quite difficult to get your point across in an effective way. So I regard a failure at performance art as not what I want to see and very disappointing, but I am much, much more prepared to excuse that than I am the deliberated on failure to effectively distance the institution from noxious commentary purporting to come from within the institution. And I want to say to this group, I want to say to you and to your colleagues, Michael, that trustees have an obligation here.
Yeah.
Trustees have an obligation, trustees should not be getting engaged in deciding whether we should have Keynesian professors or monetarist professors of economics. They really shouldn't. That would be inappropriate and wrong. But it is precisely at the boundaries between the internal work of the institution and the big world where trustees have an obligation to insist that the university set an appropriate moral tone. And I think Harvard's trustees have been a consistent and ongoing failure to this day in this regard. And I think that is true of many other institutions, unfortunately, as well. Their failure to condemn the incidents of anti-Semitism on campus, their complete reluctance to date to offer a theory of what Harvard is doing going forward after the catastrophe of the fall semester. I think that trustees need to be reconsidering their role at moments like this in setting a moral tone.
Thank you for that. Thank you. They may be handsome, but they're not cheerleaders. They may be generous, but they're not walking piggy banks. They're fiduciaries. They should be the guardian of values. And if they have a president who has refused to speak out in clear moral tones, then they can. They have the capacity to do ultimately anything. And they should certainly respect the boundaries, obviously, of the classroom. As you've said, they need to respect academic freedom. But the deafening silence is absolutely appalling. And perhaps they might even take some remedial actions if the school can't bring the kinds of speakers onto campus that bring intellectual diversity. They can have a trustees' distinguished lecture series. They can be the people who appear at the moments when the campus climate otherwise is averse to such things as taking an objective look at Israel. Thank you for that, Dr. Summers. The rehabilitation is going to be a long and upward climb. And I think hard about the echo chamber that has been created, where it seems everyone, including the president, seems to be intimidated about pushing back. I look more for those moments like when Lee Bollinger, who had the unenviable task of introducing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, took it upon himself to explain why he would have his free speech, but he would have things to answer for.
I agree. I agree with. I agree. I agree with that. Ultimately, trustees have the responsibility for what goes on university campuses. People talk about the idea that a student who disrupts activities or a student who threatens another student can't be disciplined without faculty approval, like it's the First Amendment to the US Constitution. It actually isn't. It's a set of customs that exist that should not constrain the fiduciaries of institutions from making sure that the basic concepts of safety and civility on which those institutions depend are honored. And so I think trustees need to act wisely, but need to not be inert. Now, I say that with very much of an awareness that in a number of states in our country, there has been excessive political intrusion by public trustees into the work of universities and attempts to prescribe what books cannot be taught in literature courses, to remove books from libraries, to insist on particular versions of American history being instructed on. Those are terrible things. Those are terrible things too. And in some ways, they may even be more terrible things. So it is not as simple as saying trustees need to assert themselves. They need to assert themselves wisely, which means having the ability to distinguish between issues of fundamental principle and issues of political viewpoint. And I think that is what we're very much looking for. It's what the best trustees have been able to do. But I think we have in general, had a real failure on the part of trustees in many universities to stand up to a particular perspective that has become increasingly common over time in faculty circles. And that's been particularly a problem in some of our elite universities. And I think there's a need for a more resolute approach. I mean, this is not new. Just before I became president of Harvard, there was an incident in which the president's office was occupied for 15 days. And as the occupiers left, the usual occupants of that building surrounded them and clapped for them as they left, and no one was ever disciplined. That should have been regarded as outrageous. by our trustees, but at that time it was not. So I think there is a real need for some strong actions.
Dr. Summers, this has been wonderful. And if I may, I'd like to invite you to a longer conversation at some point in the future. This has been so enlightening, but I'm afraid we have to wrap up now and move to the panel part of the webinar. So I thank you. Welcome back to today's discussions. Discussions of what is arguably the most urgent question of values that higher education faces, addressing the growing tide of anti-Semitism on college campuses while guarding the practices of academic freedom and free speech that are the honor and lifeblood of higher education. We are up against the oldest and, in terms of capacity for devastation, the most dangerous hatred in human history. And just to take FBI statistics, it's a hatred that has been manifesting itself in ever-increasing acts against Jews in America. Can we frame and enforce policies to counter such a disgrace to the American Academy, a disgrace that antedated October the 7th? And as passions run high, it is also too easy to compromise the core values of discourse and the imperative of the Academy to investigate and discuss even the most uncomfortable ideas and truths. We can only start to address these challenges in the brief time before us, but we have three outstanding leaders, thought leaders, to help. These are admired friends of myself and ACTA. We've been privileged to know them and to learn from them. Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School and past president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. The titles of her two books, published with Oxford University Press, will make it immediately clear why her insights are so essential. The first is Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And most recently, Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. Noam is the director of the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information, Emeritus Professor of Finance and Economics, the Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Business Responsibility, Emeritus, and Special Research Scholar at the Columbia University School of Business. He has written or co-authored over 30 books and 400 articles, with particular focus on communications. Recent titles include Who Owns the World's Media? Media Concentration and Ownership Around the World, Digitized Labor, the Impact of the Internet on Employment, and the Telecommunications Revolution. What does not always show up in Professor Noam's bio is the pivotal role he played in Columbia's early adoption of the Chicago Principles of Freedom of Expression, and his role as a pilot in the Israel Defense Forces in the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And joining us today from Israel is Pamela Paresky, Senior Fellow at the Network Contagion Research Institute, Senior Advisor to the Open Therapy Institute, and advisor to the Mindful Education Lab at New York University. Her work appears in Psychology Today, the Jewish Journal, the New York Times, and elsewhere. And she's taught at Johns Hopkins, the University of Chicago, and the U.S. Air Force Academy. Well, I'd like to start this discussion with a seemingly simple but crucial question for Pamela and Ellie in particular. What is anti-Semitism today? It has manifestations on the right and the left, the latter being by far today the most frequent campus manifestation, and one that's growing in virulence. And then Nadine, it will be vital to hear your thoughts on how we distinguish between anti-Semitic acts that should clearly be actionable, though the extent to which campus administrations often fail to do so will be a real topic for investigation. And that between speech, which, however disagreeable, must be protected. It seems that suddenly some college leaders have discovered the advantages of institutional neutrality, although the timing of that often reeks of hypocrisy. What is the guidance that we can get now from the Calvin Committee report? And as time permits, I would be interested in a do-over of the infamous December 5 episode. And moving further afield, if time permits, I'm already thinking we're going to have to do a follow-up to this. We might explore the possible relationship between the ideological imbalance prevalent on the campus today and the damage that does to discourse and understanding and the pursuit of truth. And finally, coming back to trustees, I'll take this one on myself. What can boards do to create a more wholesome campus? So once again, for the audience, please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And a reminder that this session is being recorded. So please, to start with, over to you, Pamela and Ellie. Thank you for being with us.
Go ahead, Pamela.
I was going to say you should start.
Michael, who should start?
Okay. I'm going to elect Pamela, having read a couple of her articles in the Jewish Journal. But then I want to go right over to you, Ellie.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, what Larry Summers said was really important. In particular, he mentioned the importance of highlighting anti-Semitism rather than censoring it when it's not the type of anti-Semitism that spills over into, the conduct that is that crosses a line. And then, of course, Nadine can talk more about what that is. But I want to start by reminding people something that they may not have been thinking about, which is that the chants "Jews will not replace us" and "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" mean precisely the same thing. And so for people who find "Jews will not replace us" an abhorrent chant, they should find the other similar chants as abhorrent. The other thing that happens on campus is that people complain that any criticism of Israel is called anti-Semitic, and that silences legitimate criticism. And that is a deflection for the most part, though I think some people are really confused about what the difference is. And one place to look is Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds of anti-Semitism with respect to anti-Zionism. If you want to look for delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. In the interest of time, I'm not going to unpack them all. But I also want to point to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So that's the IRA definition. And then there's a lot of detail giving examples. But you have to note that it only may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Sometimes it's not expressed as, as hatred. And also that it's a certain perception. So what is that certain perception? That involves basically a conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism is essentially a conspiracy theory. It involves themes of replacement, of privilege, of appropriation, covert domination, pretense, and dehumanization, and also genocide and bloodlust. That is part of the long history of what we now call anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism wasn't always seen as anti-Semitism, which I just want people to understand that when the term anti-Semitism was created in the late 1800s, it was like anti-racism to the people who believed it. They believed that they were ridding the world of something bad. And I want to just read something, and then I will turn this right over to Ellie. I'm going to read something that I want the audience to hear a Palestinian protester saying this, okay? I say this without a trace of religious prejudice. It is a confirmation of a cultural and historical fact. The polemical language that conditions sometimes force upon me can and must be understood as no more than a cry of pain from one of the oppressed. We are not hateful. We merely have no desire to have our rights restricted by Zionist parasites. We are incapable of achievement before alien domination, which has been forced upon us. For 75 years, the fight against Zionist domination has lasted. Okay, I want you to hear that, because that is not something that a Palestinian protester has said. I just switched out Zionist with Jewish, and that is what Wilhelm Marr, the person who coined the term anti-Semitism, said about Jews.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Let me first thank ACTA and Michael for convening this. This is sadly a timely and important topic. And the question then is often raised in discussions, which is how do you define anti-Semitism? And there are debates going on about this. My own position is I don't care, actually. I challenge the importance of the discussion over the definition for several reasons. First, because anti-Semitism on some level is one of those you know it when you see it situations. We can go on defining it, but it comes, you feel it, especially if you're on the receiving end. Secondly, and relatedly, does anyone have required those who condemn, and rightly condemn, racism to provide a definition of racism? Does anybody who protests George Floyd's situation post his murder have to explain their outrage? When almost all Jewish students by surveys feel seriously or somewhat affected by anti-Semitism on campus, do you then still have to engage in politicized wordsmithing exactly about the definition? At Columbia, our new president, Shafiq, did what presidents always do best. When there's an issue, they appoint a committee, a task force on anti-Semitism, and it's been inundated by challenges on kind of how do you define it before you even talk about it. At the Columbia Law School, the Student Senate refused the recognition of a group called Students Against Anti-Semitism because they didn't like the definition of anti-Semitism of that group, a definition which was mentioned by Pamela, that was kind of adopted by more than 40 countries, the US Congress, et cetera, et cetera. But they would not recognize it because they had this verboten type definition. But thirdly, and perhaps more importantly, I would say, thirdly, I would say it really makes no difference where you draw the line. Whether you draw the line a bit here or a bit there, it's fine. But there's plenty of space of genuine anti-Semitism, clear anti-Semitism left wherever you draw the line, and you deal with that. So I think the problem does not go away because by playing with the definition. But fourthly, and perhaps most fundamentally that I'd like to address, is the issue of anti-Semitism on campus is much wider. And it is not just about hate speech from the right and disruptions from the left or the other way around. I always get this confused. There is a much more insidious form of anti-Semitism on campus, and I would like to call this a systemic anti-Semitism. It's the invisible kind. It's part of the emerging structure of universities. And for that, we and you, the trustees, have to pay particular attention. Let me look for a moment at history. At Columbia, we had, in the first half of the century, a president for 43 years, Nicholas Murray Butler. And before that, he was 12 years dean of the faculty and basically ran the place already. He was a Nobel Prize winner for peace. He was a US vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party. Before President, okay, so during his regime, almost 50 years, only 2 Jews served on Columbia's Board of Trustees. Benjamin Cardozo for 4 years, and Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, who also supported him, as it happened, for as a vice presidential candidate. Now, this was then, but what is it now? It so happens that a few days ago, I received from my alma mater a ballot for trustees. I looked at those names, and I hate to do this, but I was looking for Jewish names. And there are 30 trustees. And guess how many Jewish names I could find? 0, 0, 0. Now, considering the fact that Jews are a significant part of the student body, of the alumni body, of the faculty, of the donors, how can you possibly explain that? And it's not that there was somebody there who says we don't want Jews. No, that's much more, it's different. It is more that we would like to have more of this and more of that. And in the process, kind of the Jewish participation, representation, higher education gets shrunk. And it's not only on the level of the trustees. I'm sure you can find this in other universities too. It's also on the level of student admissions. Again, if you look at the data, for many decades, Jewish students were kept out of the elite higher institutions by geographic diversity, by geographic distribution, by other means. It's a long story. It's an unhappy story. It's a shameful story, but not for now, including at Columbia. But after World War II, after the Holocaust, you couldn't do this anymore. And so eventually, within 2 or so decades, the participation of Jewish students in the process grew to about 25 to 30% almost. At Harvard, between 20 and 25% in the 70s and 80s. But it has now dropped in the last several years down to from over 20% to below 10% quite rapidly in a few years. And this is, of course, part of more general admission of minorities, which means that the participation of white students has declined. At Columbia, it's about 30% of student body is white now. At Harvard, it's about 35%. At Yale, it's 37%, I believe. And so, of course, then the Jewish participation declines, but it has declined more. And some of that, and this gets to the systemic part, is also enforced by a bureaucracy, the DEI bureaucracy, that is well-meaning in intention, but the actual result means that as you bring in, as you fight racism, as Kendi says, you also kind of bring in counter discrimination. If you fight discrimination, you bring in other forms of discrimination. That's exactly what happens. So Jewish students have declined in number. Jewish faculty hiring has declined. Visitors from Israel have declined. There are all kinds of perfectly legitimate reasons for it, but that is what's happening. That form of anti-Semitism, which does not dare to speak its name, that form of anti-Semitism that people don't acknowledge, it's kind of implicit, but it is a form of discrimination, is something that trustees should do something about by having the consciousness that is actually happening on campus right now.
Thank you. That is so very important. I would only push back a little bit about DEI offices. My friend Jay Green published a study recently in which he got the available social media, Twitter records of as many DEI officials as he could, and the number of anti-Israel tweets and the number of relatively benign tweets about China was such a revelation that unfortunately we do have people who have a deaf ear to campus antisemitism. And I'll just mention one incident that seared my consciousness, watching the video on Twitter of a student at Harvard wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, surrounded by a group of hostile people, shouted at, not given free passage. And what did Claudine Gay have to say about that? Absolutely nothing. If that had been a trans student or a Black student, we would have seen quite a different response. And I'm not for a moment saying that one should tolerate incidents against any group, but the fact that the Jewish student wearing a kippah didn't even call for a response tells us something about an ambience in which we have a whole lot of rehabilitative work to do. But I now, since we've gotten on to actions, want to turn this over to Nadine.
So, Michael, I just want to clarify, when you said you were pushing back against Ellie on DEI, what you are saying is he was too laudatory when he said that their goals are positive. You are suggesting that they are not even faithfully living up to those indisputably positive values of diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to Jews. And that's an aspect of anti-Semitism, if I may, from the left that my distinguished co-panelists did not allude to, but I think really bears noting. To the best of my knowledge, Barry Weiss was the first person who really started talking about this in a wonderful little book she wrote about 5 or so years ago, that DEI on many campuses, there are obviously exceptions, but let me just say on too many campuses, DEI divides everybody into a binary, oppressor or oppressed, privileged or victim. And Jews are automatically in the oppressor category. So by definition, Jews can never be a victim of denial of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in one of the silver linings to the terrible cloud of what's happened on campuses, including after October 7th, is DEI is now being subject to very close re-examination. It seems to me the debate now is only over, do you get rid of it entirely, or is it something that can be very deeply reformed? I want to thank you, Michael, and Mike, and Larry Summers, and Ellie and Pamela for wonderful insights. I think that Ellie's spotlighting of the other very deep-seated manifestations of anti-Semitism is a really interesting segue to the extent to which, by focusing on speech and words, even the most ugly, loathsome words that Pamela quoted, is a diversion from what we really care about, which are the root causes of the attitudes that are expressed in those words and the discriminatory and even violent actions that manifest those attitudes. One of the reasons why, as somebody who is absolutely committed to doing whatever we can to root out anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, one of the reasons why I bristle at the overemphasis on censorship as a purported solution is that it is a distraction from what the actual problem is, a diversion, which may very well do more harm than good. That said, there is a tremendous amount of not only discriminatory anti-Semitic conduct, including violent conduct. Michael, you referred to one incident. Unfortunately, it's all too typical of reported instances of actual assault, not to mention actual physical battery, that are reportedly going unremediated. But there also are so many reported examples and documented by video footage. I realize that's imperfect evidence, but it's certainly prima facie evidence of expression that even to the strongest champion of free speech, including most justices on the United States Supreme Court, would say this speech is unprotected because it satisfies the distinguishing factor that was laid out by the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, notably Justice Louis Brandeis, when he said, only an emergency will justify repression. If you loathe the idea, including the hateful slogans that Pamela referred to, you ignore it, you answer it back, you refute it, you try to persuade people not to adopt it. But if the speech, considered in context, not just for its loathsome message, but in the particular facts and circumstances, poses an emergency by directly causing or imminently threatening certain specific serious harm, and by harm, Brandeis did not mean my feelings are hurt, my emotions are upset. I don't mean to trivialize those we know, having been subject to anti-Semitic speech. It is very painful, but it's not the kind of harm that should be remediable by the law. No, that kind of harm is when you are put in reasonable fear that you're going to be subject to an immediate attack. That's a punishable true threat. Or when you are suffering a so-called hostile environment form of harassment, when there is such pervasive and severe expressive conduct that it effectively deprives you of an equal educational opportunity. We often use the lay term intimidation to describe that kind of hostile climate. There's targeted harassment or bullying directed at individual students. There also are content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions that even if you're going to chant pro-Israel slogans, you may not do that as well as chanting anti-Israel slogans in the library where students are trying to study or taking over administrative offices where the business of the university is sought to be accomplished. And unfortunately, until a few examples you referred to recently, Michael, we've just seen a failure of will to enforce those limits, even at schools that have very strong free speech principles on paper, including the University of Chicago.
If I can just jump in, because I absolutely always love listening to Nadine. And she reminded me of something that she has said before, which is that part of the importance of freedom of speech and in enforcing freedom of speech is to enforce the limits of freedom of speech. So when things cross the line, they absolutely must be dealt with.
Because that intimidates and chills other people's freedom of speech, not to mention freedom of movement, as we read about Jewish students and faculty members who don't even dare leave their dormitory rooms or go to their classes.
Now, if I can jump in, I agree with my fellow speakers, of course, but let me just say one of the positive things about the current upheavals is that the political left on campus has rediscovered its love for the First Amendment. For a while, historically, the left was pro-free speech. And then when it assumed positions of power, it kind of shifted over, and suddenly the conservatives were the ones upholding it. But now it's kind of swung over back, at least on the level of freedom of speech for me, but not necessarily for thee. But secondly, and this goes back to the discussion with Larry Summers, even if campus speech might be lawful, there has to be also a morally based counter speech by leaders of the institutions. Yes, you may say that, but it's wrong and we condemn it. And thirdly, the problem, as Nadine alluded to, is not just free speech, it's unequal speech. It's what Pamela mentioned as the one of the Ds, the double standard discrimination, that you can say certain things. You can on campus, you can talk about the destruction of Israel without any repercussion, but you cannot say anything about somebody who has a certain disability or want to change their gender. Then immediately you're ostracized and disciplinary actions even take place against you. That double standard leads then to this Title VI type discrimination lawsuits that, when they will work themselves out, and they will, might be really expensive issues for universities, not only to defend themselves, but also to pay up afterwards. And you as trustees should be really mindful what's coming down the pipe.
Thank you so much for that. the asymmetries are absolutely overwhelming, and they do bespeak a certain matter of will. I often think that at that terrible show on December 5th, I've sometimes likened it to the Three Stooges Go to Congress. There was an underlying reason that the three presidents were so steeped in an ideology in which Jews really don't matter that much. They don't need protection, that they couldn't give the kind of full-throated, a call for Jewish genocide is always unacceptable. I'm not talking about what might happen in a graduate seminar where we talk about really horrible things, but no, and here, Nadine, stop me if I'm treading on shaky territory of the First Amendment. But when a group of students call out Intifada now, globalized Intifada, on a college campus where Jews are walking and going about their business, how different is it from saying, let's have a pogrom, or how about a lynch mob? I think we've got
You are allowed to, I want to set the record straight. You are allowed to do that under the First Amendment if the only element of the distress is the message. And let me be very precise about this. This is not a radical proposition under First Amendment law. Way back in 1969, the United States Supreme Court unanimously issued a decision that not a single justice has disagreed with since then, despite the many other differences among them, where they said even advocacy of violent or lawless conduct is constitutionally protected. The line is crossed only when it's not just advocacy, but it's incitement, and moreover, intentional incitement to imminent violence, which is likely to happen imminently. And lest people be disgusted by that strong pro-free speech standard, let me point out that it has been availed of by civil rights leaders who give fiery, impassioned talks in which they use incendiary rhetoric. Let me also go back to one of Ellie's points, Michael, which is even with a very narrow definition of constitutionally unprotected speech, there is so much evidence that the line has been crossed on so many campuses. And I'm being precise. I'm referring to detailed complaints that I have read that have been brought by Jewish students and organizations against a number of campuses, including Columbia and Harvard. And we're talking complaints that are almost 100 pages long with hundreds of specific allegations, that it's not just chanting odious slogans in the middle of the campus. It's deliberately targeting and sometimes following Jewish students. It's invading classrooms. It's confronting physically with menacing gestures students who are perceived to be Jewish or Israeli and so forth.
Right. So if, as the president said, it all depends on the context. We have a context.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I'd like to add too to that what we've been seeing lately is student groups that are violating known rules, and they are asserting that they will violate the rules and then violating them by entering classrooms, by marching through buildings during class time and
Dare
library.
we say entering a private home in the case of Dean Erwin Chemerinsky at Berkeley Law School a few days ago?
And not leaving a private home when asked. So these are the conduct and the context. But also, I want to just note something about the overarching context, the ideological context that makes these students think that what they're doing is either free speech or is in some way a legitimate violation, that they're doing something positive. They don't think that they're doing something bad. They think they're doing something good for a good cause. And what I want to just highlight in getting back to the importance of understanding something about the definition of anti-Semitism is that whatever the moral concern of the day is, that is the concern that will be used against Jews. And wherever the line is between good and bad in that concern, Jews will always be on the other side. And so that's where you can tell anti-Semitism is happening. In this case now, it's about social justice. It's about human rights. That's the language of the day. It used to be race. And before that, it was religion. And I've said many times that if you look at the right wing or Nazi, neo-Nazi version of anti-Semitism, where being white is the moral good, then Jews are not white. And in this new paradigm where whiteness is an unmitigated evil, Jews are considered white, and it's at the same time. So you can see how this works, how it's not an accident that Israel becomes the white settler colonialist state, where obviously none of those things are true. But also there's one other aspect of it, which is something I call word games. So you take just the word settler, for example. In Israel, there are settlements that are in the West Bank, but there are also the kibbutzim, and the word that they translate as settlements because that's just the word. It's where people go and settle, and it's not about colonial settlers. It's not about stealing land. All this land in the Negev was available to them under Ottoman law, and so legally, they accessed that land. They weren't colonizing anything. They weren't a part of an empire, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all about word games. And if you can convince people that those words mean the old thing, then you can convince people that there are meanings attached that are just not attached.
Yeah. Of course, colonialists, more than 2,000 years of continuous living in the area. The ignorance factor is, of course, another one. I want to leave us a little time to go back to something that you had mentioned. Ellie, you had mentioned Title VI and the whole issue of climate. I yield to you, Nadine, about First Amendment law. And, we absolutely, you can't ask for it and then deny it. But what about Title VI and the creation of a hostile environment? To what extent does that kick in?
That's what I was referring to earlier, Michael, when I said, let me go into a little bit more detail about the legal standard, which is somewhat forgiving of universities, because if they are confronted with evidence of a persistent pattern of conduct, including expressive conduct, that is sufficiently severe and pervasive, that it effectively deprives somebody of an equal educational opportunity, then they must not show deliberate indifference. So there's actually quite a lot of discretion that's given to universities to come into compliance. But from the sickening allegations I've read and complaints, if even a small portion of those allegations are correct, there really does seem to be a hostile environment. We should explain that this applies to any university that accepts government funding, which is almost 100% of them. On the ignorance here, not only about history and nature of anti-Semitism in the Middle East, but the ignorance on the First Amendment principles. We had several incidents last week, just in the last week, of what under First Amendment law is called a heckler's veto, where disruptive protests are preventing a speaker from speaking, preventing the audience from hearing him. And then we have these ignorant university leaders leaders saying, oh, that's an exercise of free speech. And one example, somewhat ironically, involved Jamie Raskin, Congressman Jamie Raskin. I say somewhat ironically because he's not been the strongest defender of free speech in some contexts, but he was shouted down at which university was this? American University. And I'm sorry, it's one of the universities in Washington, D.C. and the University of Maryland. University of Maryland. And the president, Darrell Pines, as this was described by Jonathan Turley, said the president pulled a Raskin because Raskin had previously somewhat defended disruptive speech. And here's what the president of the university said. What you saw play out actually was democracy and free speech and academic freedom. From our perspective as a university, these are the difficult conversations that we should be having. No, no, no. Those were the arguments that were made by Southern sheriffs and other officials during the civil rights movement when they said, oh, stop, we're exercising our free speech rights when we're shouting down these nasty protesters, Martin Luther King and so forth.
Now, if I can add to that, part of the problem that we're now kind of the landmines that we're kind of planting for the future is that the ticking time bombs is that unequal enforcement right now. At Columbia, for example, on time, place, and manner type restrictions, there were several organizations that blatantly and openly violated these rules. Eventually, it was too much. And two of these organizations were suspended for one semester. But then they just kept going. They were suspended, but they were there. They didn't have official recognition. But so what? Okay, so then about 2 weeks ago, there was another demonstration and speakers supporting literally terrorism of terrorist organizations spoke, and 4 students were suspended. Those students are still on campus. They're holed up in their college dormitory rooms. They're being lionized by fellow students who bring them food and watch videos with them, and they're kind of like celebrities on campus. They will not leave, and the university will not make them leave. And in the future, when other groups, then it will not be about Gaza and not be about the Middle East, will also kind of act disruptively, and the university suddenly then develops a spine and kicks them out, there will be charges of unequal enforcement of their policies. And rightly so. One has to draw a line and one has to defend it. And it's really important for trustees, whatever their political persuasion is, for the sake of their institutions, to make sure that the institution has rules, clear rules, communicates these rules, and enforces them.
That actually brings up the part of the issue with the 3 presidents when they spoke in front of Congress. Nothing that they said was actually entirely inaccurate. It is context dependent. As Nadine spoke about, she gave the context, and Ellie said, too, that here's the context in which it's a violation, and it has been happening as a violation. But what was just so, noticeable, I guess, obvious, was the double standard, was that, these are the colleges that have in writing, requirements about microaggressions, about avoiding microaggressions. And it's hardly a microaggression to call for the genocide of an entire people, but a micro is a violation of a policy without any context. And the macro requires the context. That was really what people, found so jarring. But that also brings up the problem of, and I don't want to cause a marital dispute here, but about university presidents making statements of morality.
Yeah. disagreed with that comment that Ellie made, although again, in context. So what we're talking about is if we were writing on a clean slate, I would absolutely unequivocally support approaches of institutional neutrality. I think Ellie would too, for the reasons that were so well explained by the Calvin Principles back in 1967, that it is precisely to maximally liberate every individual member of the campus community to express his or her viewpoint on these contested issues that universities should remain silent, should not make any declarations, except as to issues that directly affect the university itself. So, if there's a piece of legislation that's going to impose curricular requirements on you, as Larry Summers alluded to, you should speak to that, but not on the global or national political or cultural issues of the day. What again was the double standard that was somewhat distressing here, were a number of institutions whose presidents were opining on every single issue that people asked them to opine on, who either did not speak or spoke too late or spoke too lamely about the Hamas attacks. Now, some universities have said we are going to use the lessons we've learned from this, including the lesson that no matter what you say, you're going to make everybody angry, and it's a tremendous waste of time, as well as having a chilling impact on community members, that better late than never, we're moving forward, going to adopt institutional neutrality principles. I would say, maybe it's a pretext to avoid condemning violence against Israel, but let's hold them to it. Let's make sure that they really do neutrally adhere to policies of institutional neutrality moving forward.
Well, sadly, we are coming to the end of this discussion, and I can only ask that we have a little bit more time at another date to continue this discussion. We've just gotten on to Calvin, and that takes up what Larry Summers had said about moral leadership and how those two things can be effectively combined. But I had promised our rather large audience some question and answer. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Claire Doyle, who's going to be presenting some of the questions. And let me say, and I will say it again, thank you for a really rich and wonderful discussion that I hope we can continue at another time.
Yes, thank you all. And thank you, Michael. So we do have a number of questions from the audience. So I'll start with our first question. Bad speech on campus is bad, but how do you balance that against the risks of censorship, especially on our campuses? Most important, who at particular college or universities get to decide what specific statement is and is not permitted? And if not, who then gets to decide the punishment?
Well, in the first instance, whichever body on campus is responsible for discipline, ultimately, if it's contested, the determination will ultimately be made by a court. Unfortunately, we have seen, universities have been completely uneven in how they enforce their rules against what they call discriminatory harassment. Often those rules are written in extremely subjective language, overly broad and vague. And one of the bases for challenging those rules is precisely that they give so much room for discretion that effectively allows the enforcers to pick and choose the speakers they like and dislike and the ideas they like and dislike. But let me just put in a pitch here that FIRE, an organization that I've been very active with, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, is very ready to make sure that either as written or as enforced, the rules do comply with First Amendment standards, or on a private campus with their own free speech policy standards.
Okay, we have another one, Claire?
Yes. So our second question is kind of similar, but regarding statements of moral values by the institution, administration, trustees, in response to hateful but protected speech, would this include responding to every racist, sexist, anti-Semitic tweet, social media post by students, faculty, and staff that comes to the university's attention?
I think we covered that pretty much with the, with the Calvin. I know Ellie wants to say something, but if I can just say that one of the things I hear people talk about a lot, the concerns that they have, are how should deans and presidents respond to these kinds of truly hateful things that are said on campus. Should they denounce them? Should they condemn them? I'm with Nadine. I think the Calvin report is very useful. I think institutional neutrality is very important. But also, as we saw with the three presidents, part of what made their statements so ridiculous and part of what made their silence on what happened on October 7th so loud was that, as Nadine said, they had come out and talked about all of these things in the past. And then it's a statement to not say something. So, at some point, it's going to be valuable for presidents to say, we know we haven't done this in the past. We haven't been good at this in the past. And we're starting this now. And maybe it's an inconvenient time to start it and it seems like it's bad. But we promise that we are going to remain neutral. And that's what they should have said on when they were speaking to Congress. They should have said, instead of saying we have a long history of protecting freedom of speech and et cetera, they should have said we have not done this well. And we are working on this. And had they been honest about their failures, it wouldn't have been such a travesty. The other part of the issue is not morality, but truth. And part of what happens in this particular issue is, as immoral as it is, it's also, as I think Nadine and Ellie were both saying, there's so much ignorance involved and so much just factually inaccurate information that is being circulated. And one of the things that happens when people get very caught up in DEI, initiatives, et cetera, is that they lose sight of the purpose of the university, which is truth seeking and knowledge creation. And that has to really be primary on campus. And that's one thing that I think trustees need to really hold presidents' feet to the fire on, that the mission of the university does not get discarded in order to promote some values that people think are nice.
It is not necessary. Thank you, Pamela. I don't think it is necessary or desirable for university leadership to, in a reactive way, to react against anything that somebody says or does. I mean, there's kind of, you want to budget those statements. In fact, possibly not even make statements. Statement kind of like diplomacy crafted by a public communications department where every word gets parsed. Perhaps more important is to establish a sense of moral values of the institution. And that is something that has to be done proactively. And when something does happen, a statement is not the only way to react at all. You can, for example, a president can demonstratively have dinner at the Hillel Club, at the Hillel House on a Friday. Trustees can do the same thing, and not just the Jewish trustees. They can show support, not necessarily to Jewish organizations, also to other organizations. When something goes wrong, they can be involved. They can participate, and they go to events. They can be panelists. They should show and learn and speak and communicate. So the written statement is just one tool, and it's probably not a particularly good one.
I want to give one little plug to the address that I mentioned, 2002, of Larry Summers. So prophetic in its way. And I think we would all agree that's a good example of setting a moral tone,
Yes.
rather than being reactive. Although at some point we should talk about, I know Nadine, you and I have talked about the Lee Bollinger moment with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, maybe an exceptional situation, but there, it did seem to square the circle of both free speech and moral leadership. But I should turn this back to the audience, Claire.
So I think we have time for one more question. Our last question is for those of us who are trustees, who on campus do we need to talk to get a real idea of the student experience?
Wow. Let me put in a plug for something that has been done on a number of campuses. I think one really great example is the University of North Carolina, and it's something that FIRE and I believe Heterodox Academy have also advocated for all campuses, and that is to design a survey for students involving the expertise on campus, hopefully interdisciplinary. Ideally, it would be ideologically diverse, although on many campuses that's not even available among the faculty. But in other words, there should be buy-in on the part of the faculty that this is a, scientifically vetted and designed survey tool that will ascertain what the student's actual experience is and what the faculty members' experience actually is, because surveys show that the vast majority of presidents will say the free speech climate on my campus is excellent. It's terrible everywhere else. And then you look at the actual survey evidence and it's terrible on their own campuses. So presidents, and many thanks to the trustee who asked that question, there are ways that you can ascertain, but it should not be anecdotal through no matter how many conversations you should have. That should not be a substitute for a more rigorous social science validated approach.
Okay, but let me just kind of argue with that a little bit. Certainly, you don't want to learn what is happening on campus through the official channels if you're a trustee. You will get pre-digested, filtered information. Even worse, if you talk to the officials dealing with students and climates, first, they're biased and they're protective of their accomplishments and jobs, etc. They're not a good source, frankly. I think the best source almost is kind of to walk into a dining hall and talk to students, or to have some student or some faculty member bring in 4 or 5 or 6 students or faculty members and you chat with them. I think this is much more productive than the official.
I wasn't talking about, if I was saying you should involve individual experts on campus, but let me also say that for the past 5 or so years, FIRE, together with College Pulse, has been doing a very rigorous data-driven survey of the free speech situation. Last year, they did it of 248 campuses. And as Pamela kind of alluded to, part of the reason for the, facetiousness of that answer about we're so great, we really believe in free speech at Penn and Harvard, was that they ranked numbers 248 and 247. But there's a lot of detailed information in those surveys that will cover many of the universities that are represented here. And FIRE is completely happy to have detailed consultations with people who are connected to particular universities to go into the data more deeply, to do a deep dive.
And I'll just add that Harvard ranked dead last and in fact had to be rounded up to 0. So that's what we were looking at. I would say that in addition to and those two things are both good. Anecdotes are very, anecdotal evidence isn't all of it, but it is good to have a narrative because people our brains don't really work well with statistics. So we do need to understand through stories, and the statistics are exceptionally important so that we understand what is actually happening on campus. But one thing that just the last couple of weeks has really highlighted for me is that even the presidents of colleges and universities don't understand what constitutes free speech. And if the presidents don't understand, surely the students don't understand. And so all of the work that Nadine does and FIRE and ACTA could also come together to do orientations at the beginning of school, and also to promote the importance of the primacy of the mission of higher education, the mission of the university. And also one other thing that's lacking is courage. And I know we're running out of time, but students also, I know it's a lot to ask of students, but now that I've been here in Israel for three months, I almost said 3 years, it's felt like 3 years. It's been 3 months here, and I've met the most extraordinary young people who are the same age as college students who are risking their lives. They're risking their lives. And what do college students risk? They risk some people not liking them, being called names. Mostly they're not risking physical violence. I know it's really hard. It really is. But we really need to help students have the courage to speak up and not fear whatever that reputational damage is going to be.
Well, that takes us back to moral leadership. And I want to thank you. I just want to add one kind of technical suggestion for the trustee. We have been doing, it's expensive, very large surveys, 1,000 to 2,000 students on a campus, so that we can get at the subgroups. What is it like to be a religious student on campus? What is it like to be a conservative student? And those findings are often quite different from the general findings. And they're costly to do, but before a campus says we're clean, it's really important to know, what is it like for those who are outside of the mainstream? Well, with that, I will only say that if you would accept the invitation, I'd love to continue this discussion with you again before long. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to all the people who have been listening and sharing, and apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to, but be with us again.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Kelly and Pamela.
Thank you, trustees.
Bye.